The first light came slowly to the hills of Judea, as it always had, as it always would, not rushing, not announcing itself with trumpets, but seeping gently into the darkness like oil spreading across water. The limestone cliffs caught the light first, their ancient faces turning from gray to amber, then to gold. Below them, the small town of Bethlehem stirred. A rooster crowed, then another. The sound carried across the terraced hillsides where olive trees stood in their patient rows, their silver leaves beginning to catch the morning breeze. From somewhere in the valley, a donkey brayed. A door opened, wood scraping against stone, the sound of water being poured into a clay vessel, a woman's voice, soft, calling children to wake. This was the world as it had been for generations. This was the world as it would be for generations more. And in this world, on this morning, in a small stone house on the eastern edge of town, a young man named Tobias opened his eyes. He lay still for a moment, watching the light creep through the small window above his sleeping mat. Dust motes danced in the beam, tiny worlds spinning in their own silent orbits. His father's breathing was steady and deep from the other side of the room. His mother would already be awake, he knew, preparing the bread, stoking the fire that had burned low through the night. Tobias was 23 years old, though the sun and wind had made him look older. His hands were rough from years of holding the shepherd's staff, his face bronzed from days spent on the hillsides watching over the flock that belonged to his father and his father's father before him. He was not a learned man. He could not read the scrolls as the scribes did in the synagogue, but he knew the Psalms. His grandfather had taught them to him, word by word, verse by verse, until they lived in his chest like a second heartbeat. "The Lord is my shepherd," the old man would say, his voice cracking with age but strong with certainty. "Say it, boy. Say it until you feel it in your bones." And Tobias had said it thousands of times. But lately the words felt distant, like echoes from across a valley too wide to cross. He rose quietly, folding his sleeping mat and placing it against the wall. The floor was cool beneath his bare feet, packed earth that his mother swept clean each evening. He pulled on his outer tunic, the wool rough but warm, and fastened his belt. His staff leaned in the corner by the door, smooth from years of use, the top curved like a question mark. Outside, the air was sharp and clean. The sky was turning from purple to blue, and the morning star still hung above the western hills, reluctant to leave. Tobias breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the smell of earth and stone and the distant sweetness of almond blossoms from the grove beyond the town walls. He walked through the narrow streets, his sandals making soft sounds against the stone. Other shepherds were emerging from their homes, nodding to him as they passed. Old Matthias, who had known his grandfather, young Jesse, barely 15, eager and awkward with his new responsibilities. Sarah, the widow, leading her small flock toward the communal well, her face lined with worry that never seemed to ease. The town was waking fully now. The baker's oven sent smoke curling into the brightening sky. The potter was already at his wheel, his hands moving in that hypnotic rhythm that seemed as old as time itself. Two boys ran past, laughing, their voices bright as bird song. A baby cried from inside a house, then fell silent, comforted. This was home. This was safety. This was all Tobias had ever known. And yet, he reached the edge of town where the land opened up into the valleys and hills that rolled away toward the wilderness. His flock was there, penned in a stone enclosure built by men long dead. 50 sheep, maybe 60, their wool thick and yellowed with dust. They knew his voice. When he called, they would follow. This was the order of things. This was how it had always been. But as Tobias stood there, his hand resting on the rough stone wall, watching the light spread across the land, he felt something he could not name, an emptiness, a hollowness in his chest that all the water from all the wells could not fill. He had felt it growing for months now, this strange restlessness. Not dissatisfaction exactly, not unhappiness, but a sense that something was missing. That somewhere, somehow, there was a deeper water he was meant to drink, a greener pasture he was meant to find, not for the sheep, for himself. His father had noticed. "You are distracted, my son," he had said last week, his voice gentle but concerned. "Your mind wanders when it should be watchful. What troubles you?" How could Tobias explain? How could he put words to something he barely understood himself? "Nothing troubles me, Abba," he had said. "I am only thinking. His father had smiled, but there was worry in his eyes. Thinking is for scribes and Pharisees. We are shepherds. We watch, we protect, we guide. This is our purpose. This is enough. But was it? Was it enough? Tobias wanted to believe so. He wanted to feel the contentment he saw in his father's face, the peace that seemed to radiate from the old men who sat in the gate of the town, discussing the Torah and the prophets. But instead, he felt like a man standing at the edge of a great chasm, knowing he was meant to cross, but unable to see the bridge. Chapter 2. The Weight of Questions. The sheep flowed out of the pen like water from a broken jar, bleating and jostling, each knowing its place in the unspoken hierarchy of the flock. Tobias counted them without thinking, his eyes moving over the familiar forms, the old ram with the chipped horn, the ewe who always lagged behind, her gait slightly uneven from an old injury, the young lambs, born just after Passover, still clumsy and curious about everything. He led them south, toward the valleys where the grass was still green despite the season. The sun climbed higher, warming the earth, drawing out the scent of sage and hyssop that grew among the rocks. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals, patient and watchful. The sheep spread out across the hillside, grazing contentedly, and Tobias found his usual spot, a flat rock beneath a scraggly terebinth tree that offered a thin blade of shade. He sat down, pulling his water skin from his belt and taking a long drink. The water was cool and sweet, drawn from the well before dawn. He replaced the stopper and set the skin beside him, then looked out across the valley. This was his office, his workshop, his temple. This open cathedral of stone and sky, where the wind wrote sermons in the grass and the clouds preached patience as they moved slowly across the blue. He had been coming here since he was a boy, first with his grandfather, then with his father, and now alone. He knew every path, every cave where a sheep might shelter from the rain, every place where a predator might hide. But knowing was not the same as understanding. His grandfather's voice came back to him as it often did in these quiet hours. The old man had died 3 years ago, during the Feast of Tabernacles, slipping away peacefully in his sleep as if simply deciding not to wake. But his words remained, carved into Tobias's memory as surely as the ancient marks that travelers left on the rocks along the old trade routes. "Tobias," the old man had said during one of their last conversations. They had been sitting together on a hillside much like this one, watching the sunset paint the western sky. "Do you know why the Lord calls himself a shepherd in the Psalms?" "Because he cares for us," Tobias had answered, the response automatic, learned from childhood. "Yes, but there is more." His grandfather's eyes had been distant, seeing something beyond the visible world. A shepherd does not simply watch. He guides. He knows where the water is when the streams run dry. He knows where the grass is green when the land looks dead. He leads his flock through places they would never go on their own, through valleys so dark the sheep cannot see their own hooves on the path. And all the while, the sheep must trust. They must follow, even when they are afraid, even when they do not understand. This is the heart of it, boy. This is the secret. Trust is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to follow anyway. Tobias had nodded, thinking he understood. But now, sitting alone with his questions, he realized how little he had truly grasped. A lamb wandered too close to the edge of a steep drop, and Tobias rose quickly, his staff in hand. "Eh, back!" His voice was firm, and the lamb startled, scrambling back toward the safety of the flock. Crisis averted. Disaster prevented. This was his job. This was his life. Constant vigilance, endless repetition, the same paths, the same dangers, the same solutions, day after day after day. But what about his own path? Who was watching for him? Who would call him back when he wandered too close to edges he could not see? The thought brought a tightness to his chest. He sat back down, harder than he intended, and pressed his palms against his eyes. This restlessness was becoming unbearable. This sense that he was supposed to be somewhere else, doing something else, being someone else. Not a different person exactly, but a more complete version of himself, as if there were rooms inside him that he had never entered, doors he had never opened. He thought of the travelers who sometimes passed through Bethlehem, pilgrims heading to Jerusalem for the feasts, merchants from distant lands with strange accents and stranger goods. They had seen things he would never see. They knew things he would never know. And yet, they were not more at peace than he was. In fact, they seemed to carry their burdens like the donkeys carried their packs, heavy, unavoidable, wearing them down mile by mile. So what was the answer? What was the cure for this ache in his soul? The sun reached its zenith. The sheep lay down in the shade of rocks and bushes, chewing their cud, eyes half closed. This was the still part of the day, the quiet hours when even the wind seemed to rest. Tobias lay back on the warm stone, his staff across his chest, and closed his eyes. He did not sleep, but entered that space between waking and dreaming where thoughts become images and memories become visions. He saw his grandfather's face, young somehow, though Tobias had never known him young. He saw green pastures that might have been real or might have been imagined. He saw water, clear and deep, reflecting a sky so blue it seemed to sing. And he heard words, not spoken aloud, but rising from somewhere inside him, or perhaps from somewhere far deeper than inside. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. Tobias opened his eyes. The sky was the same. The sheep were the same. The world had not changed, but something in him had shifted, like a stone rolling away from a mouth of a cave he had not known was sealed. What if the restlessness was not a problem to be solved, but a calling to be answered? What if the emptiness was not a void to be feared, but a space being prepared for something new? What if the questions themselves were the path, and the seeking was the finding? The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Chapter 3. The Voice in the Evening. The days that followed were the same and yet different. Tobias performed his duties as he always had, leading the flock out at dawn, bringing them back at dusk, checking each one for injuries or illness, defending them from the occasional jackal or wild dog that dared to venture too close. But now everything felt charged with possibility, as if the ordinary world had become translucent and something extraordinary was shining through from behind. He began to pay attention differently, not just watching, but seeing, not just hearing, but listening. The way the morning light touched the dewdrops on the grass, each one a tiny universe. The pattern of the stars as they wheeled overhead during the night watches, spelling out messages in a language he almost understood. The sound of water trickling over rocks in the wadi, a song without words, but full of meaning. He also began to remember not just the recent past, but deeper memories, things he thought he had forgotten. His mother singing to him when he was small, a lullaby that was really a psalm. His father teaching him to read the weather by the color of the sky at sunset. His grandfather telling stories of the patriarchs. Abraham leaving everything he knew because a voice told him to go. Moses leading a nation through a wilderness they could not cross on their own. David writing songs in caves while running from enemies he could not defeat. Stories of trust, stories of guidance, stories of journeys that made no sense until they were over and the travelers could look back and see the pattern they had been walking all along. One evening, as Tobias was leading the flock back toward Bethlehem, the sky caught fire. The sunset that night was unlike any he had ever seen. Great banners of red and gold and purple streaming across the western horizon, as if heaven itself had torn open and was bleeding glory onto the earth. He stopped walking, and the sheep stopped with him, the whole procession standing still on the hillside, caught in the light. And in that moment, Tobias heard it, not with his ears, but with something deeper, a voice that was not a voice, a knowing that was not knowledge, clear as spring water, gentle as a mother's hand, and as undeniable as the ground beneath his feet. Go. Just that. One word. But it contained multitudes. Go where? When? Why? How? The questions tumbled through his mind, but the voice did not answer. It did not need to, because underneath the questions was something more fundamental. Certainty. The kind of certainty that has nothing to do with understanding and everything to do with trust. The sunset faded. The sky returned to its normal evening blue. The sheep began moving again, eager to reach the safety of the pen. And Tobias followed them, his mind racing, but his heart strangely calm. That night, after the evening meal, he sat with his father by the fire. His mother had gone to tend to the neighbor's sick child, and his younger sister was already asleep on her mat in the corner. It was just the two of them, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, the familiar sounds of the night settling around them. "Abba," Tobias said, his voice quiet but steady. "I need to tell you something." His father looked up from the rope he was mending, his strong hand still, his eyes attentive. "I am listening, my son." Tobias took a breath. "I need to make a journey." A journey? His father's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. "Where will you go?" "I don't know." "When will you leave?" "Soon. Maybe after the Sabbath." "And why?" "What are you seeking?" This was the hardest question. How could he explain what he barely understood himself? But his father deserved honesty, even if the truth was incomplete. "I am seeking understanding," Tobias said slowly, feeling for the words like a man feeling for stones in a dark river. "I have been leading the flock all these years, but I feel like I am also one of the flock, and I need to know. Who is leading me? Where am I being led? What pastures am I meant to find?" He looked at his father, hoping to see understanding, fearing to see disappointment. Does this make sense? His father was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the fire. Then he set aside his rope and spoke, his voice carrying the weight of years and wisdom. When I was your age, I felt the same. I wanted to leave Bethlehem, to see Jerusalem, to understand the scriptures in a way that went beyond what the rabbis taught in the synagogue. Your grandfather knew. He did not stop me. Instead, he gave me his blessing and his staff and told me one thing: the Lord is faithful. He will not let your foot slip. He will watch over your coming and going. So I went. I was gone for 2 months, and when I came back, I was ready to be your father, ready to settle, ready to receive the flock and the responsibility, because I had learned what I needed to learn. Tobias felt something loosening in his chest. What did you learn, Abba? His father smiled, and in that smile was sadness and joy intertwined. That the seeking itself is the answer, that the journey is the destination, that God does not guide us because we are lost, but because He wants us to discover we were never lost to begin with. He reached over and placed his hand on Tobias's shoulder. Go, my son, go with my blessing. The flock will be here when you return, and so will I. Tears stung Tobias's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. Thank you, Abba. Thank the one who calls you. I am only the doorkeeper opening the gate. That night, Tobias lay on his mat, unable to sleep, his mind alive with plans and possibilities. He would need provisions: water, bread, dried fruit, perhaps some cheese, his warmest cloak for the cold nights, his staff, of course, a small portion of coins, carefully saved from selling wool at the market. But more than these things, he would need something else: courage. The courage to leave safety, the courage to trust that he would be guided, the courage to believe that the one who called himself shepherd would not abandon his sheep in the wilderness. He rose before dawn on the morning after the Sabbath. His mother had prepared food for him more than he could carry, her way of saying all the things she could not put into words. His father gave him his own water skin, old but well made, the leather soft and supple from years of use. His sister hugged him tightly, making him promise to come back soon. I will, he told her, hoping it was true. And then, as the first light was breaking over the hills, Tobias walked through the gate of Bethlehem and turned his face toward the wilderness. Chapter 4. The First Steps. The road south from Bethlehem was ancient, worn smooth by countless feet, merchants and soldiers, pilgrims and refugees, each carrying their own stories, their own burdens, their own hopes. Tobias joined this invisible river of humanity, though at this early hour he walked alone. The land changed gradually as he descended from the highlands. The terraced hillsides gave way to rougher terrain, the cultivated fields to wild scrubland. The olive trees became sparse, replaced by twisted acacia and low, thorny bushes that seemed to cling to life through sheer stubbornness. This was the edge of the wilderness, the place where civilization ended and chaos began, or so people said. But as Tobias walked, he did not feel threatened by the wildness. Instead, he felt a strange kinship with it. This land was not tamed, not domesticated, not forced into patterns that served human comfort. It was itself, raw, honest, uncompromising. And in its austerity, there was a kind of beauty that the green valleys could never match. By midday, the sun was fierce, pressing down from a sky bleached almost white with heat. Tobias found shade beneath an outcropping of rock and sat, drinking sparingly from his water skin. The water was already warm, tasting of leather and earth, but it was life itself flowing down his throat. He ate a piece of bread and some dried figs, slowly, making them last. His mother had taught him that eating quickly on a journey was foolish. It left you hungry again too soon and made you careless with provisions. Savor each bite, he would say. Give thanks for each swallow. Food eaten with gratitude nourishes more than the body. As he ate, he watched the landscape shimmer in the heat. Mirages appeared and dissolved. Pools of water that were not there, cities of silver that vanished when he blinked. The wilderness was teaching him its first lesson. Not everything you see is real. Not every promise of relief is true. You must learn to distinguish between illusion and substance, between what glitters and what actually sustains. By late afternoon, Tobias met his first fellow traveler, an old man bent with age, leading a donkey laden with goods. The man's face was weathered like ancient wood, his eyes sharp and knowing. "Peace be upon you," Tobias called out, using the traditional greeting. "And upon you peace," the old man replied, his voice surprisingly strong. He stopped, and the donkey stopped with him, its long ears twitching. "You are young to be traveling alone. Where are you headed?" "South," Tobias said, then realized how vague that sounded. "Toward the wilderness." The old man's eyebrows rose. The wilderness is not a destination. It is an obstacle to be crossed on the way to somewhere else. What lies beyond the wilderness for you? Jerusalem? The Salt Sea? Egypt? Tobias hesitated. How could he explain that he did not know, that he was following something more felt than understood? But the old man's eyes were kind, and there was no judgment in his question, only curiosity. "I am seeking understanding," Tobias said finally. "Ah." The old man nodded as if this explained everything. "The most dangerous journey of all. Men have died seeking understanding, and men have been reborn finding it." He gestured to the ground. "Sit with me a moment. These old bones need rest, and the donkey does not mind." They sat together in the shade of the rock, and the old man pulled out a small skin of wine and a piece of hard cheese, which he shared without being asked. The wine was sour but refreshing, and the cheese was salty and good. "I am called Ephraim," the old man said. "I have been a merchant for 50 years, traveling these roads, buying and selling, making my living from the needs of others. And in all those years, do you know what I have learned?" Tobias shook his head. "That the roads teach better than the rabbis, that the wilderness preaches sermons the synagogue cannot match, that every journey changes the traveler, whether he knows it or not." Ephraim took a long drink from the wineskin and wiped his mouth. "You are seeking understanding. Good. But understand this, you will not find it where you expect. You will find it in the spaces between destinations, in the silence between words, in the emptiness that frightens you." "The emptiness," Tobias repeated softly. "Yes, I have felt it. We all do, if we are honest. That hollow place inside where we expect God to be loud and clear and instead find only quiet. But the quiet is not absence, young shepherd. The quiet is presence, the loudest presence of all, if we learn to hear it." They sat in companionable silence for a while, and Tobias felt something settling in him. The anxiety that had been his companion since leaving Bethlehem eased slightly. Not gone, but gentled, like a wild animal learning to eat from an open hand. Eventually, Ephraim rose with a grunt, and the donkey stood as well, knowing the rhythm of rest and travel. "I must continue north," the old man said. "You must continue south. But before we part, let me give you something." He reached into one of the packs on the donkey and pulled out a small clay lamp, the kind used in homes throughout Judea. Simple, unadorned, but well made. "For the dark times," Ephraim said, pressing it into Tobias's hands, "because there will be dark times. The wilderness is not only physical, it is also spiritual. And when the darkness comes, and it will come, remember, even the smallest light is enough to guide the next step." You do not need to see the whole path. You only need to see where to place your foot next. Tobias closed his fingers around the lamp, feeling its weight, its solidity. Thank you. Thank the one who sends help to travelers. I am just a merchant who happened to be on the right road at the right time. Ephraim smiled, and there was something ancient and knowing in that smile. Go well, young seeker, and when you find what you are looking for, or when it finds you, remember those of us who are still traveling. And with that, the old man and his donkey continued north, and Tobias continued south, and the sun continued its slow descent toward the western hills. As evening approached, Tobias found himself in a narrow valley between two ridges of rock. A small stream trickled through the center, barely more than a thread of water, but enough. He filled his water skin and drank deeply, then splashed the cool water on his face and neck. The relief was immediate and profound. He found a level spot above the stream and prepared to spend his first night in the wilderness. He gathered stones to make a small ring for a fire, collected dry brush and a few pieces of wood from a dead acacia, and used his flint to strike sparks until a flame caught. As darkness fell, the fire became his companion, its light pushing back the shadows, its warmth a comfort against the cooling air. Tobias ate more bread and fruit, then wrapped himself in his cloak and lay on the hard ground, his staff beside him, the fire crackling softly. Above him, the stars emerged, first a few, then dozens, then thousands, then millions, until the entire sky was ablaze with light. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a road made of diamond dust. He thought of the psalm his grandfather had taught him. He leads me beside still waters. This tiny stream was hardly still, but it was water, and it was enough. He restores my soul. Was that happening? Was this journey beginning to fill the emptiness, or was it only making the emptiness more apparent, like digging a hole to find water only to discover how deep you must go? Sleep came slowly, but when it came, it was deep and dreamless, the sleep of a body exhausted and a soul beginning, just beginning to open. Part 2, The Journey. Wave 1, The Desert of Testing section. A. Into solitude. Tobias woke to the sound of birds, small desert sparrows whose cheerful calls seemed incongruous in this harsh landscape. The fire had burned down to ash, and the morning air was cold enough to see his breath. He sat up stiffly, his muscles protesting the night on hard ground, and looked around at the day being born. Everything was silver and blue in the pre-dawn light, quiet except for the birds and the faint whisper of the stream. He rose and went to the water, splashing his face and arms, the cold shocking him fully awake. He said his morning prayers, the Shema, that every Jewish boy learns before he can walk. And as he spoke the ancient words, he felt connected to something larger than himself. Every faithful man and woman, past and present, speaking these same words, creating a chain of prayer that stretched across time. After a simple breakfast of bread and water, he packed his few belongings and continued south. The valley narrowed and then opened into a wide plain covered with loose stones and scattered boulders. The heat built quickly once the sun cleared the eastern ridge, and by mid-morning it was punishing. This was the true wilderness now. No villages, no fields, no signs of human habitation, only rock and sky and the endless patient sun. Tobias walked steadily, conserving his energy, his staff clicking against the stones with each step. The rhythm became meditative. Step, click, breath, step, click, breath. His mind emptied of specific thoughts and filled instead with a kind of wide awareness, taking in everything and nothing. Around noon, he saw other travelers in the distance, a small group, maybe 4 or 5 people, heading east toward the Dead Sea. They were too far away to hail, and Tobias felt no desire to call out. The solitude was becoming something he welcomed rather than endured. In the silence, he was learning to hear. He stopped for the heat of the day in the shade of a large boulder, eating sparingly, drinking carefully. The sun was an enemy here, draining strength, creating thirst that could kill. But it was also a teacher, showing him his limitations, revealing how small he was in the face of the vast indifference of nature. And yet, he did not feel abandoned. Even here, especially here, he sensed something, not a presence exactly, but an attention, as if the wilderness itself was aware of him, as if he were being watched over, even in this place that seemed designed to break men. His grandfather's words came back. The shepherd knows where the water is when the streams run dry. Tobias looked at the small stream nearby, barely flowing, but persistent. Enough. Always enough. Not abundance, but adequacy. Not excess, but sufficiency. This was the provision of the wilderness. Just enough for today. Teaching trust for tomorrow. Section B. Trials of body and spirit. The days began to blur together. Morning, midday, evening, walk, rest, sleep. The landscape changed subtly. More stones here, more sand there. Occasional patches of scrub grass where hidden water fed roots beneath the surface. Tobias learned to read these signs, to see where life persisted, even in apparent desolation. His water ran low on the 4th day. He had been careful, but not careful enough. By evening, the water skin was nearly empty, and no stream or well was visible. Fear touched him for the first time. Real fear, not the abstract anxiety of the journey's beginning, but the primal terror of a body recognizing its mortality. He made camp in a small depression between rocks, building no fire because he had found no wood. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly, and he wrapped himself tightly in his cloak, shivering. The stars came out, as magnificent as always, but tonight they seemed cold and distant, beautiful but uncaring. Tobias tried to pray, but the words felt hollow, bouncing off the sky and falling back on him like stones. Where was the guidance? Where was the provision? Had he been a fool to leave Bethlehem? Had he misheard the voice, mistaken his own restlessness for divine calling? The night was long and bitter. Doubt wrapped around him like chains, and every comforting thought he tried to hold on to slipped away like water through his fingers. He remembered his grandfather's teaching about the valley of shadow, but the words brought no comfort. He was not in a valley. He was on a plain, exposed, visible, and yet utterly alone. Just before dawn, in that darkest hour when hope is hardest to find, Tobias closed his eyes and whispered into the emptiness, "I trust you, even now, even here, even if I do not understand. I trust you." The words cost him everything to say, because they were not spoken from certainty, but from the desperate decision to believe despite all evidence. And in that moment, something shifted, not externally. The wilderness remained the wilderness, the darkness remained the darkness, but internally, in that hollow place where the emptiness lived, something small and fragile stirred, a spark, a breath, a whisper answering his whisper. "I am here." When morning came, Tobias rose stiffly and continued south without knowing why, moving on faith alone. Within 2 hours he crested a low ridge and saw below him a sight that made him weep, a small oasis, a real one, not a mirage. Palm trees clustered around a spring, and beside the spring was a stone well, old but maintained, with a rope and bucket. He half ran, half stumbled down the slope, and fell to his knees beside the well. He drew water and drank deeply, the cool liquid like a resurrection, bringing him back to life. He drank until his belly was full, then poured water over his head, his arms, his feet, washing away the dust and fear and despair. "Thank you," he said aloud. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." And in his heart he knew this was the lesson of the wilderness. Not that there would be no thirst, but that the water would come. Not that there would be no fear, but that provision would be made. Not that the path would be easy, but that he would not walk it alone. He rested at the oasis for a full day, letting his body and soul recover. Other travelers came and went, a family heading to Jerusalem for a festival, two merchants arguing about prices, an old woman traveling alone who smiled at him but said nothing. The oasis was neutral ground, a place of common need where strangers became temporary neighbors. On the evening of his rest day, as Tobias sat by the spring watching the sunset, a man approached and sat beside him. He was perhaps 40 years old, his face deeply tanned, his eyes bright with intelligence. "You have the look of a seeker," the man said without preamble. Tobias smiled. "Is it that obvious? To those who have sought, yes. I am Daniel. I teach in Jerusalem when I am there, but I come to the wilderness often. It clarifies the mind. I am Tobias, a shepherd from Bethlehem, a shepherd seeking to understand the shepherd and appropriate symmetry." Daniel picked up a small stone and turned it over in his hands. "Tell me, young shepherd, what have you learned so far?" Tobias considered. "That I know very little. That trust is harder than I thought. That water tastes better when you've been thirsty." Daniel laughed, a genuine sound of delight. "Yes, yes, exactly. The wilderness is the great teacher because it strips away all pretense. In the city, we can pretend to be self-sufficient. We can fool ourselves into thinking we do not need this." He gestured at the spring, the water, the oasis. "But here, the truth is undeniable. We are fragile. We are dependent. We are sheep who need a shepherd whether we admit it or not." They talked long into the night, and Daniel shared stories from the scriptures, not as dry lessons, but as living testimonies. Abraham in the wilderness, learning to trust promises that seemed impossible. Hagar in the wilderness, discovering that God sees those whom society overlooks. Moses in the wilderness, encountering a bush that burned but was not consumed. And Israel, Daniel continued, his voice soft in the darkness, 40 years in the wilderness, an entire generation learning that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Tobias listened, feeling each story settle into his bones like stones building a foundation. The fire had burned low, just embers now, pulsing with their own quiet heartbeat. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient dance, the same stars that had looked down on Abraham, on Moses, on David. "But tell me," Daniel said, leaning forward slightly, his face illuminated by the dying light, "what do you think the wilderness actually teaches? What is its true lesson?" Tobias thought carefully before answering. "That we are small, that we need God. Yes, but there is something more." Daniel picked up a handful of sand and let it trickle slowly through his fingers. "The wilderness teaches us that everything we think is essential, comfort, security, certainty, these are not essential at all. What is essential is relationship, connection, trust. The wilderness strips away everything that is not real, everything that is not true, until all that remains is the question, will you trust when you cannot see? Will you follow when you do not know the destination? And if the answer is no, Tobias asked quietly, then you return to your Egypt. You go back to slavery disguised as safety. But you, Tobias, you have already said yes. You are here, are you not? You left Bethlehem. You walked into uncertainty. The question now is not whether you will trust, but how deeply. They sat in silence for a long time after that, each man alone with his thoughts, yet companioned by the other's presence. Eventually, Daniel rose and bid Tobias good night, disappearing into the darkness toward wherever he had made his camp. Tobias lay down beside the spring, his cloak wrapped around him, listening to the water's endless conversation with itself. He thought about trust, about depth, about the journey still ahead. And as sleep finally came, he dreamed of green pastures he had never seen, of water clearer than any he had known, of a voice calling his name in a language older than words. Section C, the Oasis Interior. Morning at the oasis was a revelation of its own. Tobias woke to the sound of voices, other travelers who had arrived during the night, a family from Hebron making pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the Feast of Weeks, 2 young men, brothers, traveling to find work in the coastal cities, an elderly couple who moved slowly but with dignity, their faces peaceful despite their obvious poverty. There was an unspoken protocol at oases, a courtesy born of shared need. Water was drawn and shared without payment. Bread was broken and passed to strangers. Stories were exchanged like currency, each tale a gift given freely, enriching both teller and listener. Tobias found himself sitting with the elderly couple as the morning heat built. The man's name was Simeon, and his wife was called Hannah. They had been married, Simeon told him, for 43 years. 43 years, Tobias repeated, trying to imagine such a span of shared life. 43 years of learning the same lesson, Hannah said, her voice gentle and amused. She was mending a tear in Simeon's robe, her fingers still nimble despite their age. How to be one flesh when you are 2 very different people. And have you learned it? Tobias asked. Simeon laughed, a sound like water over stones. We are still learning, but we know more now than we did. We know that love is not a feeling that comes and goes like the wind. It is a decision we make each morning when we wake, a choice to see the image of God in each other, even when that image is obscured by human weakness. Hannah looked at her husband with such tenderness that Tobias felt he was witnessing something sacred. He has been my shepherd, she said softly, leading me beside still waters when life was turbulent, and I have tried to be his in return. There it was again, that phrase from the psalm. But now it was not just poetry, it was lived reality, woven into the fabric of 2 lives joined together. The Psalm of David, Tobias said. You know it. We live it, Simeon corrected gently. Or try to. It is one thing to recite words, another thing entirely to let them shape your days, your choices, your heart. The Lord is my shepherd. Not was, not will be, but is. Present tense, continuous, every moment, whether we acknowledge it or not. They shared a simple meal together, dates and almonds, hard cheese, and fresh water from the spring. As they ate, Simeon told Tobias about their own journey years ago when they were young. We had nothing, he said. Hannah's father did not approve of our marriage. He was a merchant, I was a potter. He thought she could do better. So we left with only what we could carry, and we walked to Jerusalem to begin again. We had 3 copper coins between us, 3 coins in each other, and our trust that the one who had brought us together would not abandon us. And he didn't, Hannah added. But oh, Tobias, how scared we were. How many nights we held each other in the darkness, wondering if we had made a terrible mistake. But each morning there was manna, not literal manna like our ancestors in the wilderness, but provision nonetheless. Work for Simeon's hands, kindness from strangers, small miracles that added up to a life. He prepares a table before us, Simeon said, his eyes distant with memory. Sometimes that table is lavish. Sometimes it is meager. But it is always enough, always exactly what we need, when we need it. This is the secret of contentment, learning to recognize provision even when it does not look like we expected. The sun climbed higher, and the heat became oppressive. Most of the travelers retreated to whatever shade they could find, waiting for the cooler evening to continue their journeys. But Tobias, restless with new understanding, walked to the edge of the oasis and looked out at the wilderness beyond. It stretched away in all directions, vast, indifferent, beautiful in its harshness. But now, when he looked at it, he did not see only desolation. He saw a classroom, a crucible, a place where the false self could be burned away, leaving only what was true, what was real, what was essential. He thought of his father's words, "The seeking itself is the answer." He thought of Ephraim, the merchant. Even the smallest light is enough to guide the next step. He thought of Daniel the teacher. How deeply will you trust? And now, Simeon and Hannah. He prepares a table. All of them in different ways were teaching him the same thing. The psalm was not a pretty poem to be admired from a distance. It was a map for living, a way of seeing the world, a lens through which the ordinary became extraordinary, the mundane became sacred, the difficult became purposeful. "Thank you," he whispered, not sure if he was speaking to God or to the wilderness itself. "Thank you for bringing me here. Thank you for stripping away my certainties so that I can learn to trust." The wilderness did not answer, but the silence itself felt like a response, a benediction, a blessing. Wave 2, Encounters and Revelations. Section A, The Village of Questions. Tobias left the oasis the following morning, his waterskin full, his spirit strangely light, despite the heat already building. He walked east now, following a trade route that Daniel had told him would lead to a series of small villages before descending into the Jordan Valley. By afternoon, he crested a rise and saw below him a village nestled in a hollow where two wadis converged. It was small, perhaps 30 houses clustered around a central well with fields of barley and wheat terraced on the surrounding hillsides. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played in the dusty street. A dog barked. It looked, Tobias thought, like home, like Bethlehem, like every small village that had ever existed in this land. And yet, as he descended the path toward it, he felt he was entering holy ground. A woman was drawing water at the well, her movements practiced and efficient. She wore the simple clothes of a working woman, her hair covered against the sun. She looked up as Tobias approached and smiled, her face weathered but kind. "Shalom," she said. "You are far from home, young traveler." "Shalom," Tobias replied. "I am seeking understanding." The woman laughed, not unkindly. "Aren't we all? Come, drink. Water is free to those who are thirsty." She drew a fresh bucket and offered him the dipper. The water was cool and sweet, and Tobias drank deeply, then poured some over his head and neck, washing away the dust of the road. "My name is Rachel," the woman said. "I live there." She pointed to a small house near the well, "with my mother and my children. My husband died 2 years ago. A fever that came on suddenly. Now we make do as best we can." "I am sorry for your loss," Tobias said, meaning it. Rachel shrugged, but there was deep sadness in her eyes. "The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away," Blessed be the name of the Lord. She said it like a prayer she had repeated so often it had worn grooves into her soul. But come, you must be hungry. We have bread and olive oil. You are welcome to share our meal. Tobias wanted to refuse. He knew widows were often the poorest in any community, but he also knew that refusing hospitality was an insult. So he followed Rachel to her house, ducking through the low doorway into the dim interior. The house was simple but clean. Rachel's mother sat in the corner grinding grain, her hands moving in the eternal rhythm that women had practiced since the beginning of time. 2 children, a boy of perhaps 8 and a girl who could not have been more than 5, looked up at the stranger with wide, curious eyes. "This is Tobias," Rachel said to them. "He is traveling and needed water. We will share our food with him." The boy, whose name was Aaron, immediately began asking questions. Where was Tobias from? Where was he going? Had he seen Jerusalem? Had he fought any bandits on the road? Tobias answered patiently, charmed by the child's enthusiasm. The little girl, Miriam, said nothing, but watched him intently, her thumb in her mouth. After a while, she climbed onto her mother's lap and fell asleep. Her small body relaxed in complete trust. Watching them, Tobias felt something shift in his chest. Here was provision, not wealth, not abundance, but enough. Here was trust, a child secure in her mother's arms. Here was rest, the peaceful sleep of one who knows she is safe. "He makes me lie down in green pastures," he murmured, almost without realizing he had spoken aloud. Rachel looked up, her hand still breaking bread. "The psalm," she said. "Yes, I have thought of it often since I became alone. Sometimes there are no green pastures, Tobias. Sometimes there is only dust and stone and the struggle to survive. But then I look at my children sleeping peacefully at night, and I realize the green pasture is not a place. It is a state of being. It is the peace that comes from knowing you are held, even when everything has been taken away." Her mother, still grinding grain, spoke for the first time. Her voice was cracked with age, but strong with conviction. "My daughter has learned what takes some people a lifetime to understand, that the shepherd's provision is not always material. Sometimes the greatest gift is simply this: waking up each morning with the strength to face the day. That is manna enough." They ate together in comfortable silence, the bread warm and good, the olive oil rich and golden. Outside the light was fading, turning everything soft and gentle. Tobias could hear the sounds of the village settling into evening, voices calling children home, the bleat of goats being penned, the rhythmic thud of a loom. After the meal, Tobias helped Rachel carry water from the well for the next day. They made several trips, the large clay jars heavy on their shoulders. Other villagers nodded to them as they passed. An old man sitting in his doorway, a young couple walking hand in hand, a group of women laughing over some shared joke. "You have a good community here," Tobias observed. "We take care of each other," Rachel said simply. "When Joseph died, I thought I would not survive. But the village surrounded us. They brought food. They helped with the harvest. The elders made sure we were not cheated at the market. This is how we live, as one body, many members, each caring for the whole." "Like a flock," Tobias said. "Yes, like a flock. And the shepherd watches over us all." Section B, the encounter that transforms Tobias, stayed in the village for 3 days. He had not planned to, but something kept him there, a sense that there was more to learn, more to understand. He helped with small tasks, repairing a section of wall that had crumbled, carrying water for the elderly, watching the children while their mothers worked in the fields. On the second evening, he met a man named Azariah. He was perhaps 50 years old, with a face that looked carved from olive wood, all weathered planes and deep lines. What made him remarkable, what made people stop and stare when they first saw him, was that he was blind. His eyes were milky white, unseeing, yet he moved through the village with confidence, his staff tapping a rhythm that seemed to be his way of seeing. Tobias encountered him at the well just before sunset. Azariah was drawing water, his hands moving surely over the rope and bucket, and Tobias watched in fascination. "You are wondering how I do it," Azariah said without preamble, not even turning his head toward where Tobias stood. Yes," Tobias admitted, embarrassed to have been so obvious. "I hear everything," Azariah said, and there was amusement in his voice. "Your breathing, your footsteps, the way you shifted your weight when you stopped to watch. The sighted think sight is the only way to see. But there are other ways, sometimes better ways." "How long have you been blind?" Tobias asked, coming closer. "Since birth. I have never seen a sunrise, never watched the stars wheel across the night sky, never looked upon the face of someone I love. And yet," he paused, pulling up the bucket with practiced ease, "I see things others miss." "What do you mean?" Azariah poured water into his jar and then sat on the edge of the well, patting the stone beside him in invitation. Tobias sat. "I see intention," Azariah said. "I hear the truth beneath words. When someone speaks to me, I do not see their face, so I cannot be deceived by false smiles or careful expressions. I hear only their voice, and voices do not lie. Not really. I hear fear and love, anger and joy, truth and deception. I see the invisible things like God," Tobias said softly. "Perhaps, or perhaps it is just that I have learned to pay attention differently. But tell me, young traveler, and you are young, I hear it in your voice, what are you seeking in your wandering?" Tobias had told this story several times now, but each time he told it, it changed slightly, clarified, became truer. "I am seeking to understand what it means to be led, to follow, to trust. I have been a shepherd all my life, but I have felt like a sheep who does not know his shepherd's voice." "Ah," Azariah said, and in that single syllable was a world of understanding. "The crisis of direction, I know it well. I lived it for many years." "You? But you seem so certain." "So at peace?" "Now, yes, but it was not always so. When I was your age, I was full of rage. Why was I born blind? What purpose could there be in such a limitation? I railed against God, against fate, against the unfairness of life. I was bitter, Tobias, bitter as wormwood. What changed?" Azariah was quiet for a long moment. His sightless eyes turned toward the setting sun he could not see. "A rabbi came through the village. I did not want to speak with him. I had heard enough empty religious platitudes to last a lifetime, but he sought me out. He sat with me right here at this well, and he asked me a strange question. He asked, 'What if your blindness is not a curse, but a calling? What if God has given you a different way of seeing so that you can show others what they miss?' And you believed him? Not at first, but he stayed for a week, and every day he would come and talk with me. He told me about the prophets, how they saw things others could not see, not with physical eyes, but with the eyes of faith, of imagination, of spirit. He told me about the psalmist, who could see the glory of God in creation even in the darkest night. And slowly I began to understand. Understand what? That limitation is not the opposite of blessing. Sometimes limitation is the pathway to blessing. My blindness forced me to develop other senses, other ways of knowing. It made me listen more deeply, feel more intensely, trust more completely. And in that trust, I found peace. Not the peace of having all my questions answered, but the peace of knowing I am known, seen, held, even in my darkness. Tobias felt tears prickling his eyes. You have found what I am seeking. No, Azariah said gently. You have already found it. You just do not realize it yet. The seeking itself is the finding, Tobias. The journey is the destination. You left your home, walked into uncertainty, trusted that you would be guided. That is faith. That is what it means to follow the shepherd, not knowing where the path leads, but knowing who leads the path. They sat together as the stars emerged, and Azariah taught Tobias something wordless and profound. He taught him that sight is not the same as vision, that knowing is not the same as understanding, that certainty is not the same as faith. And he taught him this, that sometimes God's greatest gifts come disguised as limitations, as losses, as the very things we think we do not want. The task is not to fight against these things, but to ask, what are you trying to teach me? How are you trying to shape me? What am I supposed to see that I could not see any other way? When Tobias finally rose to leave, Azariah stood as well and placed both hands on Tobias's shoulders. You will face darkness, he said, and his voice carried the weight of prophecy. Not the darkness of literal night, but the darkness of the soul. When that time comes, and it will come, remember, the shepherd is closest when we feel most alone. He guides most surely when we are most uncertain. Trust this. Build your house upon this truth. Tobias embraced the blind man, understanding that he was embracing a teacher, a prophet, a messenger sent specifically for him at specifically this moment. Thank you, he whispered. Thank the one who sends the teachers, Azariah replied. I am only a blind man who learned to see. Section C, the synagogue and the scriptures. The next day was the Sabbath, and Tobias joined the village in their small synagogue. It was a simple building, unadorned, with stone benches along the walls and a central space for the reading of the Torah. The ark containing the scrolls sat against the eastern wall, covered with a worn but clean cloth. The service was ancient and familiar, the same prayers Tobias had heard all his life in Bethlehem, the same melodies passed down through generations. But today, everything felt different. The words were not rote repetitions, but living truths, each phrase carrying weight and meaning he had never noticed before. When the time came for the reading, the village elder, a man named Eleazar with a white beard that reached his chest, carefully removed a scroll from the ark and unrolled it on the reading table. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from reverence. Today, he announced in his clear, strong voice, we read from the Psalms of David. Tobias's heart began to beat faster. Of all the possible readings, of all the texts they might have chosen, Eleazar began to read, and the words filled the small space, echoing off the stone walls, settling into the hearts of all who listened. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. Each phrase was a hammer blow, not violent but insistent, striking the anvil of Tobias's understanding, shaping something new from what he thought he knew. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The valley of the shadow of death. Tobias had not yet walked through such a valley, not literally, but he sensed it, waiting for him, somewhere ahead on his journey. And when he reached it, would he fear? Could he say with David, I will fear no evil? You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The reading finished, and silence filled the synagogue. Not an empty silence, but one pregnant with meaning, with each person absorbing the words in their own way, applying them to their own lives. Then the community began to sing. It was not elaborate music. There were no instruments, no trained voices, just simple people singing with all their hearts. The melody carrying their faith, their hopes, their trust up to the heavens like smoke from an altar. Tobias sang with them, and for the first time in his life, he truly understood what he was singing. He was not just reciting poetry. He was making a declaration, an act of trust, a commitment to believe that even when he could not see the path, even when the way was dark and uncertain, even when his own strength failed, the shepherd would be there, would see him, would guide him, would provide for him, would protect him, would bring him home. After the service, the community shared a meal together, the Sabbath feast, simple but joyful. There was fresh bread and wine, fish from the Jordan, dates and figs, olives and cheese. They ate and laughed and told stories, and Tobias felt he had been given a gift beyond measure. Not just hospitality, though that was generous. Not just community, though that was precious, but a glimpse of something eternal, a foretaste of that final feast, that ultimate homecoming when all the scattered sheep would be gathered and the shepherd would prepare a table that would never end, in a house that would never fall, in a presence that would never fade. I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever, forever. The word echoed in his mind as he lay down that night on the mat Rachel had prepared for him in her courtyard. Forever. Not just a long time, not just many years, but beyond time entirely. Past death itself, into something more real than life, more solid than stone, more certain than breath. He fell asleep with a psalm on his lips and the stars wheeling overhead, and his dreams were of green pastures he had never seen and still waters he was moving toward with every step. Clock key, clock wave 3, the Valley of Shadow section. A. Tobias left the village 3 days after the Sabbath, his pack heavier with bread and dried fruit that Rachel had insisted he take, his heart both full and somehow more tender than it had been before. He embraced Rachel and her children, blessed Azariah once more, and received Eleazar's benediction before walking out of the village as the sun was just clearing the eastern hills. The path led south and east now, descending from the highland plateau toward the Jordan Valley. With each step, the terrain changed. The terraced fields gave way to rockier ground. The olive trees became sparse, then disappeared entirely. The air grew thicker, heavier, as he dropped in elevation. By midday, he had entered a region of deep wadis, dry riverbeds carved over millennia by seasonal floods. The stone walls rose high on either side, cutting off the wind, trapping the heat. It was like walking into an oven, the air shimmering every breath and effort. This was not the clean emptiness of the high desert. This was oppressive, claustrophobic, despite the open sky above. The rocks here were dark, almost black, absorbing the sun's heat and radiating it back. There was no shade, no water, no sign of life except for the occasional lizard skittering away from his footsteps. Tobias pushed on, trusting the directions Daniel had given him. Follow the wadi south until it branches. Take the eastern branch, and within half a day you will reach the place they call Maktesh, the mortar. It is a strange formation, a crater in the earth. Many pilgrims camp there for the night before continuing to Jericho. But half a day passed, and then more, and Tobias saw no branching, no sign of the Mactash. Had he missed it? Taken a wrong turn? He stopped and looked around, trying to get his bearings, but everything looked the same. Walls of dark stone, sand and gravel underfoot, the merciless sun overhead. For the first time since leaving Bethlehem, Tobias felt truly afraid. He was lost. He checked his water skin. Less than half full. Enough for perhaps another day if he was very careful. But if he did not find the way soon, if he wandered in circles as so many had before him, no, he would not think like that. He would trust. He would remember the lessons learned. He would... A sound stopped his thoughts. At first, he thought it was the wind, but there was no wind in this dead place. Then he thought it might be an animal. But what animal would live here? Then he realized it was his own breathing, harsh and panicked, echoing off the stone walls. He forced himself to stop, to sit, to slow his breath. "The Lord is my shepherd," he said aloud, his voice sounding strange and small in the vastness. "I shall not want." The words felt hollow because right now he did want. He wanted water. He wanted certainty. He wanted to know he would not die alone in this forsaken place. "He makes me lie down in green pastures." There were no green pastures here, only stone and heat and fear. "He leads me beside still waters." No waters, no leading, just confusion and emptiness. "He restores my soul." Did he? Would he? Or had Tobias been a fool to leave safety, to chase after some nebulous idea of understanding? Had this whole journey been a mistake, a prideful attempt to be special, to be more than just a simple shepherd from Bethlehem? The thoughts came like vultures, circling, descending, and with them came memories. Every failure, every inadequacy, every time he had fallen short. He remembered his grandfather's disappointment when young Tobias had lost a lamb to a wolf because he had been daydreaming instead of watching. He remembered his father's concern about his restlessness. He remembered the girl he had hoped to marry, who had chosen another man, someone more stable, more certain of his path. Who was he to think he could understand the deep things of God? Who was he to think he deserved guidance, provision, protection? The sun beat down, indifferent to his struggle. The stone walls enclosed him, indifferent to his fear. And in that moment of utter isolation, Tobias understood why they called it the Valley of the Shadow of Death, because this was a kind of death, the death of confidence, of certainty, of the self that thought it knew anything at all. Section B, the dark night. Tobias forced himself to move. Movement was life. Stillness was surrender. He chose a direction, east, toward where he thought the Jordan Valley must lie, and walked. His legs felt heavy, his head light. The heat was becoming dangerous now, not just uncomfortable. He knew the signs of sun sickness his grandfather had taught him, the dizziness, the confusion, the way your body stops sweating because it has nothing left to give. He found a small overhang in the wadi wall as the sun began its descent, a shallow cave that offered a sliver of shade. He crawled into it and lay still, trying to conserve energy, trying to think clearly. He took a small sip of water, wetting his lips, letting it trickle down his throat. It helped, but not enough. He was so thirsty, so terribly thirsty. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly, as it always did in the desert. Within an hour of sunset, Tobias was shivering, his sweat-soaked clothes now cold against his skin. He wrapped his cloak around himself and drew his knees to his chest, trying to conserve heat. The stars came out, brilliant and cold. Tobias stared up at them and felt nothing but their distance. They were beautiful, yes, but they did not care. They did not see. They were just burning gas and ancient light, impressive but indifferent. Where are you? He whispered into the darkness, not to the stars, to the one who had made them. Where are you when I need you most? I trusted you. I left everything I followed, and now I am going to die alone in this place, and no one will ever know. No one will find my bones. I will just disappear as if I never existed. The darkness did not answer. The silence was absolute, oppressive, crushing. It pressed in on him from all sides, filling his ears, his lungs, his mind. He had never known such silence. Even in the wilderness near Bethlehem, there were always sounds, wind, animals, the distant bark of a dog. But here there was nothing, nothing, and in that nothing, Tobias finally broke. He wept, not quietly, but with great racking sobs that tore from his chest like stones being ripped from earth. He wept for his foolishness, for his pride, for his naivety. He wept for his family, who would never know what happened to him. He wept for all the days he would not see, all the sunrises he would miss, all the life he would not live. He wept until he had no tears left, until his throat was raw, until his body was empty of everything except the most essential fact of his existence. He was alone, utterly, completely alone. And then, in that very moment of absolute desolation, something shifted. It was not a voice. It was not a vision. It was not anything he could see or hear or touch. But it was more real than any of those things. It was a presence, not arriving, because it had always been there, but noticed, finally noticed, like becoming aware of your own breathing, which never stops, but which you rarely pay attention to. The darkness remained dark. The silence remained silent. But Tobias was no longer alone in it. Someone was with him. No, more than with him. Someone was holding him, containing him. The darkness itself was not empty space, but a kind of hand cupped around him, protecting him, keeping him. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, the words came to him not from memory, but from somewhere deeper, from that place where truth lives, underneath thought, underneath fear, underneath everything else. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And he realized this was the verse he had been walking toward all along. This was the lesson the entire journey had been preparing him to learn. Not in the pleasant village, not at the oasis, not in the green pastures he had imagined, but here, in the darkest place, in the valley of shadow, because it is easy to trust when the path is clear, easy to believe when provision is abundant, easy to follow when the destination is visible. But the real trust, the deep trust, the trust that transforms, that only comes when everything else has been stripped away, when there is nothing left to rely on except the shepherd himself. Tobias lay back against the stone, his body still weak, his situation still desperate, but his soul was quieter now, stiller, like water after a storm, slowly settling, becoming clear. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. He did not understand those words before. A rod was for striking, a staff for leaning on. How were these things comfort? But now, in the darkness, he began to grasp it. The rod was not punishment, but protection. The shepherd's weapon against dangers the sheep could not fight. And the staff was not just support, but guidance. The crook that caught wandering sheep and pulled them back from cliffs they could not see. Both were expressions of the same thing, care. Constant, vigilant, fierce care that would not let the sheep be lost. I am not lost, Tobias said aloud, his voice stronger now. I may not know where I am, but I am not lost, because you know where I am. You see me. You are with me, even here, especially here. He slept then deeply and dreamlessly, his body giving itself over to whatever would come, and in the morning he would wake to find that the wadi he was in had indeed branched. He had simply missed it in his panic and exhaustion the day before. The eastern branch, just as Daniel had said, would lead him within hours to the Maktesh, where other travelers were camped, where there was water and food and fellowship. But he did not know any of that yet. In this moment, all he knew was darkness and presence and trust, and that was enough. Section C, First Light. Tobias woke to birdsong. It was impossible. There were no birds in this barren place, and yet he heard it clearly. A small, bright sound, piercing the pre-dawn stillness. He sat up slowly, his body stiff and sore, his head aching. The sky was turning from black to deep purple, the stars fading one by one like candles, being extinguished. And there, on a small outcropping of rock just above his shelter, sat a desert thrush, its throat swelling with song. Tobias watched it, mesmerized. How could such a small creature survive here? What did it eat? Where did it find water? And yet, here it was, singing, as if this desolate place were paradise itself. He provides, Tobias whispered, even here, even for the smallest of his creatures. He rose carefully, his body protesting every movement. He was weak, desperately thirsty, but alive. And now, in the growing light, he could see what he had missed in his panic the day before. There, perhaps 50 paces away, the wadi did branch. The eastern fork was clearly marked by a pile of stones, a cairn left by countless travelers who had passed this way before him. He had not been lost. He had only thought he was lost. The way had always been there. He simply had to trust it long enough to see it. Tobias gathered his few belongings and walked toward the cairn, his steps slow but steady. As he passed it, he added his own stone to the pile, a small gesture of gratitude and a sign for those who would come after. Then he turned east and continued on. Within 3 hours, as Daniel had promised, he came to the Maktesh, a vast natural crater in the earth, as if some ancient giant had scooped out the stone to make a bowl. And at the bottom of that bowl, impossibly, miraculously, was green. A spring fed a small pool, and around that pool grew grass and palms and flowering shrubs. It was an oasis of such beauty after the harsh landscape he had traversed that Tobias nearly wept at the sight. Other travelers were camped there, perhaps 15 or 20 people, families and individuals, all resting before continuing their journeys. Tobias descended carefully down the steep path into the crater, and as he reached the bottom, a child ran up to him, a girl of perhaps 6 years, her eyes bright with welcome. "Shalom!" she called out. "Are you thirsty? My mother has water." And she took his hand, this small child who did not know him, and led him to her family's tent, where her mother greeted him with the same warmth, offering him water and bread and a place to rest. "You prepare a table before me," Tobias said softly, accepting the cup of water with trembling hands, "even in the presence of my enemies." The woman smiled, not understanding but sensing the gratitude in his voice. "It is our joy to share what we have been given," she said simply. "Rest, friend. You look as though you have walked through darkness to get here." "I have," Tobias said. "I have indeed." Part 3. The Transformation. Chapter 1. Jerusalem. Rising, Tobias remained at the Maktesh for 2 days, allowing his body to recover from the ordeal of the valley. But more than his body needed rest, his soul needed time to integrate what had happened in that dark place, to understand the lesson that had been carved into him like words carved into stone. On the morning of the 3rd day, he rose before dawn and joined a group of pilgrims who were continuing to Jerusalem. They were perhaps 30 in number, men and women, old and young, rich and poor, all united by a common purpose to worship at the temple for the Feast of Tabernacles. As they walked, they sang the Psalms of Ascent, the ancient songs that generations of pilgrims had sung on this very path. Their voices rose and fell in the cool morning air, creating harmonies that seemed to make the very stones sing along. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. Tobias sang with them, his voice finding its place in the collective sound, and he felt something he had not felt since leaving Bethlehem. He felt part of something larger than himself, not lost in it, but found in it. His individual voice mattered, but it was made more beautiful by joining with others. The land began to change as they walked north and west. The harsh desert gave way to rocky hills, and then those hills became gentler, more cultivated. Olive groves appeared, their silver leaves catching the light. Vineyards terraced the hillsides, the grapes heavy and ripe. Stone walls marked boundaries between fields. Villages appeared more frequently, their white houses gleaming in the sun. And then, late in the afternoon of their second day of walking together, they crested a hill and someone cried out, "Jerusalem!" Tobias looked, and his breath caught in his throat. There, across the valley, rising from the hills like a crown of stone and gold, was the holy city. The temple dominated the skyline, its walls white as snow, its gates bronze, and at its highest point, the Holy of Holies, where the very presence of God dwelt. The setting sun caught the gold that covered parts of the temple structure, and it blazed like fire, like the glory of heaven made visible on earth. The pilgrims fell silent, all singing, stopping, all movement ceasing. For a long moment, they simply stood and looked, each person lost in their own wonder, their own prayers, their own tears. Then, spontaneously, an old man began to sing. His voice cracked but strong. "I was glad when they said to me, 'Let us go to the house of the Lord.' Our feet have been standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem, built as a city that is bound firmly together, to which the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord." Others joined him, and soon the entire group was singing, their voices carrying across the valley toward the city that had been the center of their faith, their hope, their identity for 1,000 years. Tobias sang with them, but he could barely see the city now through his tears. All the journey, the leaving, the wilderness, the fear, the darkness, the slow dawn of understanding, all of it had been leading to this moment. Not just the physical arrival at Jerusalem, but the spiritual arrival at a truth he had been seeking without knowing what he sought. They descended into the valley as the sun set, and by the time they reached the Kidron Valley at the base of the city walls, it was nearly dark. The pilgrims made camp there among hundreds of others who had come for the feast. Tents and temporary shelters spread across the valley floor like a city of cloth and hope. Tobias helped set up the camp, drawing water from the brook, gathering wood for fires, spreading blankets on the ground. The work was simple, repetitive, communal, and there was something profoundly right about it. This was how it had always been. Pilgrims helping pilgrims, strangers becoming family, the barriers of daily life dissolving in the shared purpose of worship. That night, as fires burned throughout the valley, and the sounds of singing and laughter and prayer rose like incense toward the stars, Tobias sat apart for a moment, just watching. An old man was teaching children a blessing. A young couple sat close together, their hands intertwined, their faces peaceful. A group of men were debating some point of Torah, their voices passionate but friendly. A woman was nursing her baby, rocking gently, humming a lullaby that Tobias's own mother had sung to him. This was the table prepared before him. Not a literal table, though there was food and drink in abundance, but this gathering, this community, this shared life. This was the provision of the shepherd. Not just material needs met, but the deeper need to belong, to be part of something holy, to know that you were not alone in your seeking. You look content, my young friend. Tobias turned to find Daniel, the teacher he had met at the first oasis, settling onto the ground beside him. The man's face was illuminated by the firelight, his eyes warm with recognition. "Daniel," Tobias said, genuinely glad to see him. "I did not know you would be here. Where else would I be? It is the Feast of Tabernacles. Every son of Abraham who can make the journey comes to Jerusalem." He gestured at the valley full of pilgrims, and here we are, the scattered sheep gathered. "Tell me, how has your journey been since we last spoke?" Tobias took a breath, trying to find words adequate to the experience. "I walked through the valley of shadow," he said finally. "I thought I was lost. I thought I would die. But I learned that even there, especially there, the shepherd was with me." Daniel nodded slowly, his expression serious. "The valley is where we learn the deepest truths. It is easy to trust when the path is clear. But when darkness comes, when fear rises, when we cannot see even our own hand before our face, that is when faith becomes real. Not a concept, but a lifeline. Not a belief, but a choice made moment by moment to trust what we cannot see." "Yes," Tobias said. "Yes, exactly that." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the life of the camp unfold around them. Then Daniel spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "Tomorrow we will enter the city. We will go to the temple. You will see things that will fill you with awe. But Tobias, remember this, the temple is made of stone, but the house of the Lord is not confined to stone. You have been walking in his house all along. The wilderness was his house. The valley was his house. This camp is his house. Wherever his presence dwells, wherever his people gather in his name, wherever his truth is lived and breathed and embodied, that is his house. And we dwell in it," Tobias said softly. "Not just visit, dwell. Yes, I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Not someday in some distant heaven, though that too, but now, today, always. We are already home if we have eyes to see it." Tobias felt something settle in him at those words, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. He had left Bethlehem seeking to understand what it meant to follow, to be led, to trust, and now he understood. It meant living with eyes open to see the shepherd's provision in every moment, his guidance in every step, his presence in every breath. It meant recognizing that the journey itself was the destination, and the seeking was the finding, and the questioning was the answering. Chapter 2. The Temple and its Courts. Morning came with the sound of a shofar, the ram's horn blast that called the faithful to prayer. Tobias rose with the other pilgrims, performing his morning ablutions in the brook, saying his prayers facing toward the Temple Mount, breaking his fast with bread and dried fruit. Then, as the sun cleared the eastern hills, the great procession began. Thousands of pilgrims moving together up the southern steps toward the temple gates. They came from every corner of the land, from Galilee in the north and the Negev in the south, from the coastal cities and the villages of the Transjordan. They spoke different dialects, wore different styles of clothing, carried different trades in their calloused hands. But they were one people, one faith, one family. The southern steps were broad and ancient, worn smooth by countless feet over countless generations. Tobias climbed slowly, not from lack of strength, but from reverence. Each step felt significant, each movement a prayer. Around him, pilgrims were singing, praying, weeping openly. The emotion was palpable, a living thing that connected them all. At the top of the steps, they entered through the massive gates into the court of the Gentiles, the outermost court of the temple complex. And here, Tobias's breath was taken away. The space was vast, larger than any space he had ever seen. Colonnaded porches ran along all four sides, their white stone pillars soaring upward to support cedar roofs. The floor was paved with smooth stones of different colors, creating patterns that seemed to flow like water. And rising in the center, surrounded by walls and additional courts, was the temple itself, the dwelling place of the Most High. But what struck Tobias most was not the architecture, magnificent as it was. It was the people, thousands upon thousands of people from every nation under heaven. He heard languages he did not recognize, saw clothing styles he had never imagined, smelled incense and spices from lands he had only heard about in stories. Yet all had come for the same purpose, to worship, to give thanks, to remember who they were and whose they were. Tobias moved with the crowd toward the inner courts, where only Jews could enter. They passed through another gate, and suddenly the noise level dropped. They were in the court of women now, a space of relative quiet and deep reverence. Women and men prayed here, some standing with arms raised, others kneeling with faces to the ground, still others sitting in silent contemplation. Tobias found a spot near one of the pillars and stood there, simply taking it in. The smoke of incense drifted through the air, carrying with it the scent of frankincense and myrrh. The morning light, now fully bright, streamed through the openings above, creating shafts of illumination that made the smoke visible, gave it form and substance. It rose like prayers, like the hopes and fears and thanksgivings of all these people ascending to heaven. A Levite was chanting, his voice trained and clear, reading from the Psalms. And Tobias recognized which one, his psalm, the 23rd, the song that had been his companion throughout this entire journey. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The words echoed off the stone walls, and Tobias closed his eyes, letting them wash over him. He had heard these words 1,000 times. He had recited them since childhood. But now they meant something they had never meant before. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He thought of the oases, the unexpected provision, the way water appeared when all seemed lost. He thought of the village where Rachel and her children had fed him from their poverty. He thought of every moment when he had been given exactly what he needed, not always what he wanted, but what he truly needed. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He thought of the quiet moments, the conversations that had changed him, the silences that had taught him more than words. He thought of how his soul, so restless and empty when he left Bethlehem, had been slowly, gently, patiently filled. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. He thought of the choices he had made, the decision to leave comfort, to walk into uncertainty, to trust when trust seemed foolish. And he understood now that those choices had not been his own strength, but response to a call, a leading, a gentle pressure on his heart that he had finally chosen to follow. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The valley, the darkness, the terror of being lost, and the discovery there in the deepest darkness of the presence that had never left, the protection that had never failed, the guidance that had never ceased. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. He opened his eyes and looked around at all these people, this vast family of faith. This was the table. Not food and drink only, though those were provided, but this gathering, this belonging, this knowledge that he was part of something that stretched back to Abraham and forward to the end of time itself. His enemies, his doubts, his fears, his sense of inadequacy, they still existed, but they had no power here. They were present, but irrelevant. The table was greater than their threats. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever, forever. Not as a wish or a hope, but as a present reality. He was dwelling in that house now. He had been dwelling in it all along, even when he did not recognize it, even in the wilderness, even in the valley, even in his own small home in Bethlehem. Wherever the shepherd was, there was the house, and the shepherd was everywhere. Tobias felt tears streaming down his face, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of homecoming, of finally understanding what he had been searching for. He had not been seeking a place or an experience or even knowledge. He had been seeking to see what was already true, to know what had always been real, to trust what had never failed. The Levite finished his chanting, and the court fell into a deep silence. In that silence, Tobias heard his own heartbeat, steady and strong, and underneath that, or perhaps encompassing it, another rhythm, the heartbeat of something much larger, the pulse of the divine presence that sustained all things, held all things, loved all things. He knelt then, not from duty, but from necessity. His legs could no longer hold him upright in the face of such understanding. He pressed his forehead to the cool stone floor and whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for leading me here. Thank you for the journey. Thank you for the darkness that taught me to see. Thank you for the valley that showed me your presence. Thank you for bringing me home." And in his heart, though not in his ears, he heard a response. You were never lost. You were always mine. You were always held. Welcome home, beloved son. Welcome home. How long he remained there, Tobias could not say. Time seemed to have no meaning in that space, in that moment. It might have been minutes or hours. But eventually, he became aware of someone sitting beside him. He looked up to find an old priest, his white beard long and carefully kept, his eyes kind and knowing. "First time in the temple?" the priest asked gently. Tobias nodded, not trusting his voice. "It affects everyone differently. Some weep, as you do. Some laugh with joy. Some fall silent and cannot speak for hours. But all leave changed." The priest smiled. "Tell me, son, what brought you here?" "I was searching," Tobias said, his voice rough with emotion. "Searching for understanding, for guidance, for—" He paused, trying to find the right words. "For the shepherd." The old priest's smile deepened. "And did you find him?" "I found that he had found me first, long before I knew to look." "Ah, then you have learned the greatest lesson of all." The priest stood slowly, his joints creaking with age. "Come, let me show you something." Tobias rose and followed the priest through the court of women toward another gate. They climbed a short flight of stairs and entered the court of Israel, where only Jewish men could go. From here, Tobias could see into the court of priests, and beyond that, the altar of sacrifice where smoke rose continuously toward heaven. "Look there," the priest said, pointing to the altar. "Every morning and every evening a lamb is sacrificed. Its blood is shed, its life is given to atone for the sins of the people. This has been our practice since Moses led us out of Egypt. Do you know why? To cleanse us, Tobias said, to make us acceptable before God. Yes, but there is a deeper truth. The priest's voice became soft, almost a whisper. The lamb dies so that we might live. The innocent bears the weight of the guilty. The pure makes the impure clean. And in this we see a mystery, that the shepherd not only leads his flock, but he also becomes the sacrifice for his flock. He does not stand apart from our suffering, but enters into it, takes it upon himself, transforms it into redemption. Tobias stared at the altar, watching the smoke rise, and something stirred in him, a sense that there was even more to understand, layers of meaning he could not yet grasp. But it was enough for now to know that the shepherd was not a distant figure issuing commands, but an intimate presence, willing to pay any cost to bring his sheep home. "Thank you," Tobias said to the priest, "for your words, for your guidance. I am only a doorkeeper in the house of my God." The priest replied, "But that is enough. That is more than enough." He placed his hand on Tobias's shoulder in blessing. "Go in peace, young shepherd, and remember, what you have learned here, what you have experienced on your journey, these things are not for you alone. They are to be shared, to be lived, to be passed on to others who are seeking as you were seeking. You have been found so that you can help others be found." The priest turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of worshipers, and Tobias stood alone, thinking about those final words. He had been so focused on his own journey, his own questions, his own need for understanding. But perhaps that was only the beginning. Perhaps the true purpose of being led was so that he could lead others. The true purpose of being fed was so that he could feed others. The true purpose of finding rest was so that he could offer rest to others. He was not just a sheep, he was also a shepherd. And the shepherd who had led him was now calling him to lead. Chapter 3. The Feast of Tabernacles. For the next 7 days, Tobias lived in a temporary shelter in the valley with the other pilgrims, observing the Feast of Tabernacles as commanded in the law. These simple structures of branches and leaves were meant to remind the people of Israel's 40 years in the wilderness, when they had no permanent home, only temporary dwellings, and the constant presence of God going before them in cloud and fire. But what had been meant as a remembrance of hardship became something else entirely. The shelters, flimsy as they were, became places of profound joy. Families gathered in them to eat and sing and tell stories. Strangers became friends. Children played among the branches. And every evening, as the sun set, the entire valley seemed to glow with lamplight and resonate with laughter. Tobias found himself adopted by a large family from Hebron, a grandfather named Josiah, his 3 sons and their wives, and 7 grandchildren ranging from infants to teenagers. They invited him to share their shelter and their meals, and Tobias accepted gratefully, feeling once again the provision of the shepherd in unexpected forms. "You are far from home," Josiah observed one evening as they reclined after dinner, their bellies full of roasted lamb and fresh bread. "What brings a young man like you to Jerusalem alone?" Tobias told him his story, starting with the restlessness in Bethlehem, the decision to journey, the experiences in the wilderness and the villages, the terror of the dark valley, and finally the overwhelming revelation in the temple. He spoke for a long time, and they listened without interrupting, their faces attentive in the lamplight. When he finished, Josiah was quiet for a moment, pulling thoughtfully at his beard. Then he said, "You have been given a great gift, Tobias. Not everyone who seeks understanding finds it, and not everyone who finds it is willing to pay the price of the journey. But I will tell you something. What you have learned is only the beginning. The real test comes not in the seeking, but in the living. Can you carry this understanding back to your ordinary life? Can you see the shepherds leading in the mundane days, not just in the extraordinary moments? Can you trust when you are comfortable as much as when you are desperate? The word struck Tobias deeply. He had been so focused on the journey itself that he had not thought much about what would come after. The return to Bethlehem, the return to daily routine, the challenge of living what he had learned when the intensity of the pilgrimage had faded. I do not know, Tobias admitted, but I want to try. Then you will succeed, Josiah said firmly, because wanting to try is itself a form of trust. You are not relying on your own strength to sustain this revelation. You're asking the shepherd to sustain it in you. And he will, he always does, for those who remain open to his leading. Each day of the feast brought new experiences, new teachings, new encounters. On the third day, there was a great celebration in the temple courts where the priests performed the water-drawing ceremony, a ritual that symbolized God's provision of water from the rock in the wilderness. Tobias watched as they poured water and wine together on the altar, and the two streams mingled and flowed down into channels carved in the stone. "See how they become one," an old woman standing next to him observed. "The water is our need. The wine is God's abundance. When they meet, when they mix, that is where life happens. That is where joy is born." On the fifth day, Tobias met a young scribe named Benjamin, who was visiting from Alexandria in Egypt. They fell into conversation, and Benjamin told him about the Jewish community there, how they had translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek so that Jews who no longer spoke Hebrew could still read the Word of God. "Some say this is wrong," Benjamin said, "that the sacred words should only be in the sacred language. But I believe God's truth is not limited by language. His truth can be expressed in any tongue, can reach any heart, regardless of the words used. What matters is not the container, but the water it carries." On the seventh day, the final day of the feast, there was a great procession around the altar 7 times, and all the people sang the Hallel, the psalms of praise. Their voices rose in a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the temple. "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Let Israel say, his steadfast love endures forever. Let the house of Aaron say, his steadfast love endures forever. Let those who fear the Lord say, his steadfast love endures forever." Tobias sang with them, his voice joining thousands upon thousands of others, and he felt himself disappearing into something larger, something eternal. He was not Tobias the shepherd from Bethlehem. He was not even an individual at all in that moment. He was part of the great chorus of humanity that had been praising this God since the beginning of time and would continue praising him until time itself ended. And in that loss of self, he found himself more fully than ever before. That night, as the feast concluded and pilgrims began preparing for their journeys home, Tobias sat alone on a hillside overlooking the city. The temple was lit with thousands of lamps, and it glowed like a jewel in the darkness. The sounds of singing and celebration still drifted up from the valley below. He pulled out a small piece of parchment and a charcoal stick that Benjamin had given him, and he wrote, slowly and carefully, the words of the psalm that had become his life. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. He read it over several times, each word now heavy with personal meaning, each phrase a marker of his own experience. Then he rolled the parchment carefully and tucked it into his belt, a treasure to carry home, a reminder of what he had learned. Tomorrow he would begin the journey back to Bethlehem. But he was not the same person who had left. He had been changed, transformed, renewed. He had left seeking answers and had found something better. He had found the one who was himself the answer to every question, the solution to every need, the fulfillment of every longing. He had found the shepherd, or rather, he had allowed himself to be found by the shepherd who had been seeking him all along. Part of 4. The Return. Chapter 1. The Journey Home. The journey back to Bethlehem took 4 days, and Tobias walked most of it in companionable silence with Josiah's family. They traveled slowly, not from fatigue, but from contentment, wanting to savor each moment before returning to their separate lives. The landscape that had seemed so harsh and threatening on the way to Jerusalem now appeared different to Tobias. The rocks were not obstacles, but stepping stones. The heat was not an enemy, but a teacher of endurance. Even the desert, which had terrified him in the valley of shadow, now seemed beautiful in its darkness, honest in its demands. On the second day, they passed through the same village where Tobias had stayed before, where he had met Rachel and Azariah, and heard the psalm read in the synagogue. He asked Josiah's family if they could stop for the night, and they agreed. Rachel was overjoyed to see him return safely. Her children ran to greet him, and even old Azariah came out from his house, his sightless eyes somehow finding Tobias in the crowd. "You went to Jerusalem," Azariah said. It was not a question. "I did." "And what did you find there?" Tobias smiled. "I found that you were right about everything. The limitation became the pathway. The darkness became the revelation. The seeking became the finding." Azariah nodded slowly, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Good, good. Then you can help others now. You can be for them what others have been for you. A signpost pointing the way, not the destination, but a reminder that the destination exists and can be reached." That night, after dinner, the villagers gathered and asked Tobias to tell them about his journey. He spoke simply and honestly, not trying to make it more dramatic than it was, but not minimizing the reality of the transformation either. He told them about the desert, the valley, the temple. He told them about the people he had met, the lessons he had learned, the way the psalm had come alive for him. When he finished, there was a long silence. Then a young man, perhaps Tobias's age, stood up. "I have felt what you felt," he said, "that restlessness, that sense that something is missing. But I have been afraid to leave, afraid to seek, afraid of what I might find or not find." "Then perhaps it is time to stop being afraid," Tobias said gently. "Not because the journey will be easy, it will not be. Not because you will always know the way, you will not. But because the shepherd who led me will lead you too. Because the water that satisfied my thirst will satisfy yours. Because the table prepared for me is also prepared for you. We are all his sheep. He knows us all by name." The young man nodded, tears in his eyes. And Tobias understood that this was part of his new calling, not just to have been led, but to encourage others to trust in their own leading, not to be their shepherd, but to point them to the shepherd. Chapter 2. Bethlehem Revisited. On the fourth day, late in the afternoon, Tobias stood on the hill overlooking Bethlehem. He had said goodbye to Josiah and his family at the crossroads, embracing each of them, promising to visit if he was ever in Hebron. Now he stood alone, looking down at his hometown, and his heart was full. Nothing had changed in the town itself. The same houses, the same streets, the same people going about their daily business, but everything had changed for him. He was seeing it with new eyes, understanding it with a new heart. He walked down the hill slowly, savoring the approach. Children saw him first and came running, calling his name, their voices bright with welcome. Then his mother appeared at the doorway of their house, her hand going to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "Tobias, my son!" He ran the last distance and wrapped her in his arms, feeling her small frame shaking with sobs. "I am home, Emma, I am home." His father came from the fields, his sister from the neighbor's house, where she had been helping. They embraced, all of them together, a tangle of arms and tears and laughter. His father held him at arm's length, looking into his face, and Tobias saw recognition in his father's eyes. "You found it," his father said softly. "Whatever you were seeking, you found it." "I did, Abba. Or it found me. I am not sure which. Perhaps both." That evening, after they had eaten and told stories and laughed and cried, Tobias sat with his father by the fire, just as they had sat the night before he left. But now the conversation was different. "Tell me what you learned," his father said. "Not the events. Your mother will want to hear all those tomorrow. But tell me the essence. What did you bring back that cannot be seen or touched?" Tobias thought for a long moment, wanting to get this right. "I learned that the shepherd is not just a metaphor. He is real, and he is present, and he is active in every moment of our lives. I learned that being led does not mean having all the answers. It means trusting even when you do not understand. I learned that the valley of shadow is not a punishment, but a passage, and that his presence is never more certain than when everything else is uncertain." He paused, then continued, "But most of all, Abba, I learned that the psalm you and Grandfather taught me is not just poetry. It is a map of the spiritual life. Every phrase is a truth that must be lived, not just recited. And once you have lived it, once you have experienced it in your bones and blood and breath, then you cannot unknow it. It becomes part of who you are." His father's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Yes, yes, my son. This is wisdom. This is what I hoped you would find. And now, what will you do with it?" "I will live it," Tobias said simply. "I will return to the sheep, to the daily work, to the ordinary rhythms of life. But I will live them differently. I will see them differently. And when others ask why I seem changed, I will tell them about the shepherd, not to boast of my journey, but to invite them into their own." His father smiled and placed his hand over Tobias's. "Then you have truly come home, not just to Bethlehem, but to yourself, to your purpose, to the life you were always meant to live." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, each man content in the presence of the other. Then Tobias's father spoke once more, his voice soft with emotion. "Your grandfather would be proud. He always said that the psalm was not given to us to admire, but to inhabit. You have done that, my son. You have made it your dwelling place." "As he taught me to," Tobias replied, "as you taught me. I did not walk alone, Abba. The whole journey I carried your voices, your wisdom, your faith. I was never truly alone. Us chapter 3. The New Beginning. 3,500 characters. Morning came as it always did, with roosters crowing and the slow seep of light across the limestone hills. But when Tobias woke on his first day back, everything felt different. The same room, the same mat, the same sounds, yet all of it was charged with new meaning. He rose and performed his morning prayers with a depth of attention he had never known before. Each word of the Shema was not rote, but real. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might, all your heart, all your soul, all your might. Not divided attention, but complete surrender. Not partial trust, but total commitment. This was what the journey had taught him. After breaking his fast with his family, Tobias took his staff and walked to the sheep pen. The flock was there, waiting, the same 50 or 60 sheep he had known all his life. But as he opened the gate and they began to file out, following him toward the familiar pastures, he saw them differently. Each one was known. Each one was precious. Each one needed guidance, protection, provision. And in caring for them, he was participating in the very work of God, the work of the Good Shepherd who cared for all his creatures. As he walked the old paths, Tobias began to notice things he had never seen before. The way the morning dew clung to the grass, each drop a tiny world reflecting the sky, the pattern of the clouds constantly moving, constantly changing, yet following patterns as old as creation. The call of a lark, so pure and clear it seemed to split the air with beauty. All of it was provision. All of it was guidance. All of it was the shepherd's hand, visible to those who had learned to see. Around midday, as Tobias sat beneath his favorite terebinth tree, he saw a figure approaching from the direction of town. As it drew closer, he recognized young Jesse, the 15-year-old shepherd he had seen the morning he left Bethlehem. Jesse climbed the hill and sat down beside him, breathing hard from the climb. "Tobias," he said, "everyone is talking about your journey, about how you went to Jerusalem, how you walked through the wilderness alone. I wanted to ask you something." "Ask," Tobias said gently. "I feel lost," Jesse said, the words tumbling out. "I know I am young, but I feel like I am supposed to be doing something, becoming something, and I do not know what. I watch the sheep, I do my work, but inside I feel empty, like there is a question I am supposed to be asking, but I do not know what the question is." Tobias looked at the boy, for he was still a boy really, and saw himself just weeks ago. The same restlessness, the same hunger, the same sense of something missing. "Jesse," he said, "what you feel is not wrong. It is a call. The shepherd is calling you to seek him, to know him, not just as an idea, but as a living presence. And that seeking will look different for you than it did for me. You may not need to journey to Jerusalem. You may not need to walk through the wilderness, but you will need to open yourself to being led." "How do I do that?" Jesse asked. "How do I know if I am being led or if I am just wandering?" Tobias smiled. "That is the question I asked, and here is what I learned. Start by paying attention, really paying attention, to the world around you, to the voice inside you, to the moments when something stirs in your heart. The shepherd speaks in many ways, through scripture, through other people, through circumstances, through that quiet knowing that rises up when you are still enough to hear it." He paused, then continued, "And trust, Jesse, even when you do not understand, even when the path is unclear, even when you are afraid, trust that you are seen, known, held, guided. Trust that the one who calls himself shepherd will not abandon his sheep. This is the beginning of wisdom, not having all the answers, but trusting the one who does. Jesse was quiet for a long time, his young face serious, his eyes distant. Then he nodded. "Will you teach me? Will you help me learn to see, to hear, to trust?" "I will share what I have learned," Tobias said. "But you must understand, I am not your shepherd. I am only a sheep like you, learning to follow. But yes, we can learn together. We can remind each other of the truth when doubt comes. We can encourage each other to trust when fear rises. This is how the flock cares for itself, each member strengthening the others." "Thank you," Jesse said, and there were tears in his eyes. "Thank you." After Jesse left, Tobias sat alone for a while, thinking about what had just happened. The priest in the temple had told him that what he learned was not for him alone, but to be shared. And now it was beginning. The sharing, the passing on, the multiplication of understanding from one heart to another. This, he realized, was part of dwelling in the house of the Lord, not just receiving, but giving, not just being led, but helping others learn to follow, not just finding green pastures, but pointing others toward them. Epilogue. The circle completes. 2,500 characters. Years passed. Tobias married a woman named Judith, daughter of a shepherd from a neighboring village. They had children, 3 sons and 2 daughters, and Tobias taught them all the psalm, just as his grandfather had taught him. But he taught it not as words to memorize, but as a way of life to inhabit. He continued to shepherd his father's flock and then his own flock, and the work was both exactly the same and completely different. The sheep still needed guidance, still wandered toward danger, still required constant vigilance. But now Tobias understood that in caring for them, he was learning to care for others in different ways. The patience required for sheep translated into patience for people. The watchfulness over the flock became watchfulness over his own soul and the souls of those around him. Jesse became like a younger brother to him, and together they would sit on the hillsides and talk about the shepherd, about trust, about the ways God speaks to those who are willing to listen. Other young shepherds joined them, and eventually their informal gatherings became known throughout Bethlehem as a place where questions were welcome, doubts were honored, and seeking was encouraged. Tobias's father died peacefully when Tobias was 35, slipping away in his sleep just as his own father had done. Before he died, he called Tobias to his side and said, "I am going to the house of the Lord now, the permanent dwelling, not the temporary one. But I will see you there, my son. We will dwell together in his presence forever." And Tobias, holding his father's hand, said, "Yes, Abba. Until then, I will keep walking the path you showed me. I will keep following the shepherd you taught me to trust." On the day they buried his father, Tobias stood at the grave and recited the entire psalm, his voice strong despite his grief. And as he spoke the final words, "I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever," he understood that this was not wishful thinking or desperate hope. It was a statement of reality. His father was already there, had always been there, would always be there, because the house of the Lord was not a place you went to after death. It was a reality you lived in every moment you trusted the shepherd's leading. Now, on this particular morning, as Tobias walked his flock toward the familiar pastures, he was an old man himself. His beard was gray, his hands gnarled with age, his steps slower than they once were. But his eyes were clear, and his heart was at peace. A grandson walked beside him, young Matthias, 10 years old, carrying a small staff his father had made for him. The boy was full of questions, as children always are, and Tobias answered them patiently, remembering his own questions at that age. "Grandfather," Matthias asked, "why do we say the psalm every morning? I already know it by heart." Tobias smiled. "We say it not to learn the words, but to live them. Each time we speak them, we are choosing to trust. We are reminding ourselves of what is true. We are dwelling in the reality of the shepherd's care." "But how do you know it is true?" the boy asked. "How do you know there really is a shepherd watching over us?" Tobias stopped walking and knelt down, so he was eye level with his grandson. "I know because I have lived it. I have walked through valleys where I thought I would die, and I survived. I have thirsted in deserts and water appeared. I have been lost and was found. I have been afraid and was comforted. I have doubted and was given certainty. Not because I am special, Matthias, but because the shepherd is faithful." He stood up and continued walking, the boy beside him, the sheep following behind. "Someday," Tobias continued, "you will have your own journey, your own questions, your own valleys, and when that time comes, remember what I am telling you now. You are never alone. You are always seen. You are always known. You are always held. This is the promise of the shepherd. This is the truth that endures." They reached the pasture, and Tobias released the sheep to graze. He found his favorite spot, the same flat rock beneath the same terebinth tree where he had sat as a young man, wrestling with his restlessness. And now, as an old man, he sat there in peace, watching the clouds move across the sky, listening to the wind in the grass, feeling the sun on his face. "The Lord is my shepherd," he whispered. "I shall not want." And in his heart, in that deep place where truth lives beyond words, he heard the response he had heard so many times over the years. "You are my beloved, you are my own. You dwell in my house now and forever. Well done, good and faithful servant. Well done." Tobias closed his eyes and smiled. The journey that had begun with restlessness had led to peace. The seeking had led to finding. The questions had led to the answer. And that answer was not a doctrine or a philosophy or a set of rules. The answer was a person, a presence, a shepherd who knew his sheep by name and led them through green pastures and still waters, through valleys of shadow and into light, through all the days of their lives and into forever. Tobias had dwelt in that house all along. He dwelt in it now, and he would dwell in it forever. The psalm was complete. The circle was whole. The sheep had found his shepherd, and the shepherd had never let him go. And in the distance, across the hills of Judea, the same sun that had risen on the day of his departure was setting on this day of his contentment, painting the sky with colors beyond naming, beauty beyond measure, grace beyond understanding. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life," Tobias said aloud, and all around him, in the wind and the grass and the bleating of the sheep and the laughter of its grandson, creation itself seemed to respond, "Amen, amen, forever and ever, amen."